need to identify all the barriers to communication so that we can make communication more effective. As long as we do not understand the social, psychological and physiological barriers to communication, we cannot make communication effective. What do we mean by barriers? Barriers are any obstacles or difficulties that come in the way of communication. In the context of India, there are many barriers, many obstacles and many challenges we face in the process of communication. Let us try to identify what are these major barriers so that we can try to overcome them when we are planning communication next time. What are these barriers? The major barriers are physical barriers, 2 psychological barriers, 3 mechanical barriers, 4 socio-cultural barriers, 5 linguistic barriers to communication. As long as we do not understand very comprehensively these various barriers to communication, we will not be in a position to plan effective communication. There is a noise when too many people speak at the same time, as we call it in communication. That noise leads to distortion of message. That becomes a barrier. We must try to ensure that one person speaks at one time. If two or more people speaking simultaneously, then communication gets lost. Or sometimes, if there's loud music or there's a traffic noise, communication gets lost. We must try to ensure that communication takes place in a very calm and a peaceful environment, so that there are no other kinds of noises or distortions or distractions. So that is where we must try to ensure that there are no physical barriers to communication. The other barrier to communication is the environmental stress. Let me try to identify what do I mean by environmental stress. High temperature, it's difficult when we communicate. People are not willing to listen when there's high temperature, or for that matter, humidity. We need to ensure that there is good ventilation. Poor ventilation will lead to a barrier in communication. If there is a strong glare on the people, again, communication gets lost. So we should ensure that there is no any kind of an environmental stress. We must try to conduct meetings. We must try to communicate at a place where there is good ventilation. The room temperature is cool, so that we'll be in a position to communicate effectively. The third factor is subject to stress in terms of physical barriers. Sleeplessness. Someone who had not had a sleep last night, and if you go about communicating with him, the communication will not be effective. Ill health, mood variations. There are different kinds of people who have different kinds of moods. So we need to take some of these factors into consideration. I know it is difficult to ensure all these factors, but we need to find out whether the person is paying attention. If it's not healthy, if it's not in good health, he will not be in a position to pay attention to you. At least you need to know that he is not feeling well, that he has got fever, or he is having a very difficult kind of a mood. If you can understand these factors, perhaps we can communicate effectively, because we cannot go about all the time bombarding messages. We need to take into consideration the audience temperament and audience attitude. The fourth factor is lack of media. All of us do not have access to all media in a country like India. Some of us have access to television, some of them have access to only newspapers, some of them have access only to radio, because the radio is the cheapest medium in this country. We need to find out what kind of a media is available to our target audience. Then we can go about using that kind of a media for communication purposes. So medium is the message. So we need to identify the right kind of a media for right kind of communication. Sometimes we can use multimedia approach to communication. are using different kinds of media for different kinds of target audience. One medium cannot be effective in terms of communication because the audience are varied, the audience are spread over a huge country like India. Or if you take our states into consideration, they themselves geographically very huge regions. So it becomes very difficult in terms of communication. So we need to find out what kind of media are available. And also, when we are talking about, are they familiar with the kind of communication we are making? If you are going to be using too many graphs, too many maps, some of them are not familiar with map reading. You may think that you can use a map by trying to explain to your audience. You are using charts, tables and graphs. There's too much of data, too much of statistics. All of us do not understand graphs. Some of them don't know how to read a map, and you're explaining through map how the spread of a particular message. It is not possible for them to understand. So you need to get an idea about what kind of a medium to use in terms of communication. If you are using promotional literature in terms of tourism, is that promotional literature, do the brochures or leaflets, are they going to be understood by the audience? You need to take into consideration. I would like to identify the mechanical barriers in terms of two important factors. What are these mechanical barriers? Increased difficulty in reception. What do we mean by reception? There is a transmission loss in the message. The television, there is some kind of a distortion there. The visual is not very clear. Then there's a communication loss. In the radio, there is a different kind of a noise coming up in the transmission. Then there's a mechanical barrier to communication. We are not in a position to hear that message very clearly. Sometimes message also is prevented because of certain technical problems. What are these technical problems? You are trying to speak too loudly. There's an echo. There's a resound. That becomes a mechanical problem because communication is not clear. We need to ensure what kind of a microphone needs to be used so that we can ensure that there are no mechanical problems in terms of communication. Sometimes we keep communicating over the telephone. There's a lot of disturbance over the telephone or the mobile. And a lot of us these days are communicating over the mobile. Sometimes the reception quality is poor. Once the reception quality is poor, communication gets diffused. Communication gets distorted. That becomes a barrier to communication. Now let us try to identify what are the cultural barriers. Communication has to take place in a cultural context. There are different kinds of people who have got different kinds of cultures, different kinds of values, and we need to take that into consideration and communicating that kind of a cultural context. And there are other kinds of barriers, linguistic barriers, the kind of language we are using, the kind of words we are using to explain a concept. We need to use a language which is understood by people, with which our target audience are familiar with. In India, it becomes a major challenge in terms of communication because we are a multilingual society. So we need to ensure that communication does not get lost because of language problems or semantic problems. If you're using a difficult kind of a language, there are different people who try to interpret a particular word differently, then it cannot be effective communication. In communication, we must try to minimize misinterpretation. In other words, we need to use very clear terminology. We need to use clear words in terms of communication so that communication can reach people effectively. Communicator must be credible. The medium through which we are disseminating information must be credible, because one of the major challenges we face in terms of communication, distrust in communication. People are not willing to accept the communication. And then other kinds of problems is misinterpretation of the message, which happens most of the time because we have not used the right word, we have not used the right expression or the right language. Misinterpretation takes place, distortion takes place, and then the whole purpose of communication is to see that people retain In terms of communication barriers, sometimes we say communication has broken down. Communication breakdown takes place. Why does communication breakdown take place? Communication breakdown takes place because of some reasons. What are these reasons? One reason is we have not identified the target audience specifically. We are not sure with whom are we communicating. We need to be very clear about the target audience with whom we are communicating. That is where we need to do certain amount of basic research to find out who are the audience with whom we are communicating. After we identify the audience, we need to create awareness among the audience. What do we mean by creating awareness? We are trying to develop a knowledge base in them. We are trying to give them information to them. Not only giving information to them, we want them to get influenced by our information, so that they can make use of that information, that they can go about applying that information. We can overcome major communication barriers provided we know our audience, provided we know what is the nature of media we are using, what kind of a media is relevant for them, what kind of a media is available for them. So we need to do audience research, we need to do media research, we need to do message research. We have to plan our message very well. What are the psychological barriers? All of us have got to know certain frame of references. What do we mean by frame of references? We have got to know our own thinking. We have got our own viewpoint. How do we go about developing our own thinking, our own viewpoint? Depending upon what kind of a social background and economic background you come from, depending upon what kind of a literature or books you have read, depending upon your family background. All of us have got certain frame of references, depending upon what kind of a childhood we had. All of us have got certain notions, certain fixed ideas. And then it becomes a major barrier in terms of communication. If you already have a fixed notion or a fixed idea, you already have certain frame of reference. How do I go about changing that frame of reference? So that is another kind of a barrier we face in terms of psychological barrier. Let me try to now identify different kinds of psychological barriers. All of us have got assumptions because we are trying to change that assumption. We have got to change your thinking. Why do you have those assumptions? You have those assumptions because of your upbringing, because the nature of school or college you have studied, and the nature of a background you come from. So that is where we need to ensure what are the assumptions audience have. We need to do certain amount of research to find out what are the assumptions which are there among the audience, so that we can go about changing their assumptions. The other important psychological barrier we face in terms of trying to bring about change, but there is enormous resistance to change. People are not willing to accept a new idea. People are not willing to change their attitude and their behavior. It's easy to talk about changing of attitudes and behavior in communication, but it is difficult to bring about that change attitude among the people, because people are not willing to accept a new idea, a new innovation. In a country like India, we have carried out several communication experiments in terms of family welfare, in terms of agricultural innovation. Some of them accept it. Punjab farmers tend to be more progressive. Haryana farmers are more progressive, but that's not the case with Karnataka farmers or Andhra farmers. They're not willing to accept. So we need to take these psychological problems into consideration also, so that we can go about overcome barriers to communication. The tendency on the part of audience to all the time evaluate our content, is all the time interested in saying what is the communicator saying. Instead of paying attention to what the communicator is saying, is evaluating the messages, evaluating the information he is giving. If audience become judgmental, it becomes difficult for us to communicate. And another psychological barrier to communication is selective perception. We perceive messages selectively. Selective perception is an important concept in communication. All of us do not perceive all the messages in the same manner. A lot of research is being done in terms of why people perceive certain messages the way they perceive, because of their social background, because of their cultural background. So we need to understand the concept of selective perception, and we need to overcome them. The purpose of communication is not that people selectively perceive. We want people to perceive messages the way we want to perceive them. And some of them retain some information, and some of them do not retain certain information. There's a concept called sleeper effect in communication. You have communicated that communication sleeps with the audience, and it comes as a flashback when it is relevant, when it is useful to the audience. So we need to take into consideration some of these psychological barriers into communication. And then the other psychological barrier is distrust of the communicator. The audience are not trusting the communicator. The other problem, psychological problem, is inattention to communication and premature evaluation of communication. Sometimes failure of communication takes place because of media problems, because of communication problems, or because of the channel problem, channel noise. Because the channel is not disseminating message without disturbance. It is the channel is disseminating message with certain amount of disturbance. Then we have transmission loss. One of the major barriers we face in terms of communication in this country is people are not willing to believe what we communicate orally. He says, is there anything in writing? Written word, a written message is considered to be sacred in this country. So we face a problem. Yes sir, you have communicated to me orally, but then is there anything in writing you can give me? So to make our communication effective also, sometimes if you can give a brochure, sometimes if you can give a small literature or some kind of a promotional material and a handout, communication can be effective. Some of the audience have closed mind in terms of communication. We must communicate to ensure that the capability of the audience. As long as we do not take the capability of the audience into consideration, we will not be effective in terms of communication. We need to do enormous amount of research to find out what kind of assumptions they have, what kind of prejudices they have, why do they have a closed mind, on what kind of issues they have a closed mind. Then we can go about communicating effectively. That is where, in terms of communication, we would like to identify external barriers. External barriers will include failure of the audio system, or sometimes even external barrier will constitute the way seating arrangements are made. Someone who is sitting at the end perhaps is not in a position to hear what you are saying. Then physiological problems. Someone perhaps impairment of the eye. Someone cannot listen properly. Hearing problem is there. That becomes a physiological problem. Language related problems. Inappropriate choice of words. We are not using the right word at the right place. Non-verbal communication is not good. Body language. Lack of eye contact. It is important to know when you are communicating that we need to have eye contact. And we also need to know in what kind of a context we are communicating. Inappropriate timing will lead to a major distortion, major barrier to communication. Socio-psychological barriers such as bias, prejudices, culture, in what kind of a culture we are communicating. All communication is culture specific. So I would like to summarize whatever we talked in terms of social, psychological, physiological barriers to communication. We have identified them as external barriers to communication. What are these external barriers? Semantic barriers. The language problems. In a country like India, when there are so many languages, then what kind of a language we are going to be communicating? Communication is language specific. So to overcome the barrier of communication, you need to select the right kind of a language to communicate. And our message must have clarity. The second important factor. The message is not simple. The message does not have clarity. Message planning is important in terms of communication. How do we go about planning our message? How much information we should give in our message becomes important. And then we need to pay a great deal of attention to language in terms of semantic problem. We cannot go about using complex, difficult language, technical language. We need to use language which is simple. We need to use language which can be understood by people. Communication, the purpose of communication is to clarify messages. We are in the activity of clarification. We are in the process of simplifying messages to audience. And then there are emotional and psychological barriers to communication. What are these emotional and psychological barriers to communication? Premature evaluation. We are evaluating all the time. We are all the time judging the speaker. Then there's a communication loss. And existence of preconceived notions. All of us have certain preconceived ideas, preconceived notions, and we are trying to eliminate those preconceived notions. And we are trying to see that people have an openness in terms of trying to accept new ideas and new concepts. And the other barrier we face, inattention due to lack of interest. Are we communicating with people who have interest in our message? All of us are interested in different kinds of information, different kinds of messages. We need to do research to overcome the barrier in terms of communication, to find out the information needs of people. As long as we do not find out the information needs of the people, what is the nature of information he wants? Does he want information relating to education? Does he want information relating to tourism? Does he want information relating to loans which are being given by the government? Does he want information relating to subsidies which are given by the government? So we need to find out what people are interested. Communication is people specific. And one of the major factors we face in terms of communication, we must ensure that there is credibility in communication. People understand the message completely, comprehensively, and people should make use of that information by trying to understand the various barriers I've identified: social barriers, psychological barriers, physical barriers. If you can go about planning your message properly, if you can take the factors which you have identified as barriers to communication, our communication will be very effective. The whole purpose of communication is to see that we effectively communicate with our target audience. Not only communicate with them, we give them the right information. In the process we influence them, and in the process they should be in a position to take the decision on the basis of information which you have given them. And ultimately the purpose of communication is to see that they go about adapting the message. So I would advise that you try to understand the various barriers we have identified. So next time when you do any communication planning, next time when you communicate with any kind of a situation, communicating with a group of people or communicating in a meeting, so that you will overcome these barriers we have identified. The ultimate purpose of communication is to see that communication is effective, communication is meaningful, communication is successful to the audience, so that they can go about making use of information which you are giving them, so that they can bring about changes in their life, so that they can change their attitudes and behavior.